My name is Sarah Payne. I am a faculty council member of the Public Lands History Center, and I teach in the history department. And it is my pleasure this evening to introduce you to our fall 2016 American West program event, the color of our parks, nature, race, and diversity in the National Park Service. I see many familiar faces out there, but also a couple new faces. So for those of you who are new to the American West program, this is an event that is sponsored and organized by the Public Lands History Center here at CSU. And each semester we put on one or two public events where we bring together scholars and professionals and the public to engage in conversations about issues that are important to the American West. We are looking to expand the American West program into what we hope will be a several weeks long summer series where we put on something around 22 events back to back over the course of 6 weeks or so. This is an ambitious endeavor, and we could really use your support in a number of ways. This is time-consuming and resource-intensive planning, so we appreciate very much your donations that will help us continue to bring great panelists like we have this evening to the American West program, but also to expand into that summer series. We have a couple donation baskets in the back there, as well as a giving form that you're welcome to take with you if you'd prefer to give online or at a later date. We really appreciate your generosity. Thank you so much. Tonight's event is developed out of a really central and core belief that is held by the Public Lands History Center, which is that race and diversity are central factors in shaping the history of the U.S. West, and the history of the U.S. for that matter. And so the work that you're going to be hearing about tonight and the workshop that took place earlier this afternoon with these panelists and others is going to result in a book on race in the National Park Service, which will appear in the Public Lands History Center's book series that's published through OU Press, the University of Oklahoma Press. We have 2 books already in that series, which are available for purchase just outside the doors here, as well as Camille Dungy's new book, Black Nature. She has generously offered to sign copies for you this evening after the event as well. I would take her up on that great offer. So watch out for that new book in the series forthcoming. Now to the good stuff of tonight's event. We would like to thank, first of all, our generous co-sponsors, which include CSU's Departments of History, of English, of Ethnic Studies, the College of Liberal Arts, and SOGES. I'd also like to thank Maggie Moss-Jones, who's standing in the back here, for working very hard to organize this evening's event. Thank you, Maggie. I think she deserves a round of applause. All right, well, that's enough of the intro stuff. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you this evening's illustrious panelists. So we'll start with Dr. Nina Roberts, who's going to be our first speaker. Dr. Roberts is a professor of recreation, parks, and tourism at San Francisco State University. Our next speaker will be Gillian Bowser, who's sitting on the end over here. Dr. Bowser is a research scientist in the Natural Resources Ecology Lab here at CSU. She's also an affiliate faculty member in the Ethnic Studies department here at CSU. Our third speaker will be Dr. Ruth Alexander. Dr. Alexander is our very own historian from the Department of History here at CSU, as well as a faculty council member of the Public Lands History Center. Dr. Camille Dungy will be speaking next. She's a professor of English here at CSU as well. And last but certainly not least is Alexandra Hernandez. Alexandra is the National Park Service's National Heritage Areas Regional Program Director for the Intermountain region. It's a mouthful, but I think I got it all in there. So please join me in welcoming this great lineup of panelists.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. Thanks for being here, everybody. What a great crowd. And so I am an alum of SF State. I'm teaching at SF State, alum of CSU, because in California, it's also CSU, California State University System, and SF State. It's so crazy. So I'm really honored to be here. And I have to give a shout out to a former member of my committee. I got my PhD here in the College of Natural Resources, Dr. Kathy Pickering, and a mentor and friend and colleague, Bill Timpson, was also someone that I connected with while I was here. So it's great to see them. And Val was also a professor of multicultural education while I was here, so it's great to be back. So my dissertation research revolved around Rocky Mountain National Park. And I did study constraints, and part of that is my story, but I'm just going to dive into the presentation and talk a little bit about constraints. And the reason that we thought constraints was a valuable thing to speak about is because at times we get so anxious. We get so anxious about wanting to talk about, how do we engage with people now? Community engagement is such a hot topic in national parks right now, but every now and then we don't understand what those constraints are. All right, so I'm going to start with that and talk a little bit about constraints. But before we dive into that, we also hear about, America's changing, demographics is changing, but we don't necessarily even know what that means. And over the years, I've really enjoyed what people would say is chasing the data, and that's demographic data. But today, because of the debates on the nature of the topic, I'm going to talk a little bit about how race is changing across the nation. And this is definitely a teaser in terms of the work that I do and what I'm going to share with you today. So in general, from the 2010 census, what we learned from that census was about 308 million people, right, at that point. And as things change, the population is definitely changing. So majority white still, but we see an influx, whether it's immigration, changing marriages and interracial marriages, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But as we look about projections into 2050, what we see is, and we've heard that, minorities will become the majority in this nation. It is happening. Folks that are following demographics, we're going there. It's definitely happening. So as I say sometimes, is here we come. So put your seatbelt on and get ready. How are we going to work with people of difference and different cultural backgrounds? So that's one thing. And so also, as you may know and be aware, in 2010, based on that census, what we learned was that Hispanics, Latinos account for more than half in terms of that growth, right? And what we see is, well, what does that really mean? Well, what that means is 1 out of every 6 Latinos are in this nation are Latino, identify as Latino. Okay, so that you see in terms of the growth right there. So one of the things too is the whole idea of the multiracial population, which is near to my heart, being mixed race in this country as well, in that there was an increase in 20% of interracial marriages. So if you have an increase in interracial marriages, you therefore have multiracial young people, right? And the other thing is that that is the fastest growing youth group that we see in this country as well. Okay, so I'm not going to necessarily talk about the idea of millennials. How many people were born between 1982 and, 2000, I believe? Come on, yeah, right? So that's a whole mixed race, the multi-race, the most multiracial generation ever. And so the idea of, we are not a post-racial society. We don't think we are. I realize that baby boomers kind of mess things up for the younger generations. But we have to learn from you and understand what your experiences are. So basically, if you think about the urban community, back in 1916, when the Organic Act was signed by the federal government in terms of the national park system, was about 40% people lived in urban areas. And now, from 1980, 2000, as of a couple of years ago, almost 81% of our U.S. population, again, moving into 323 million people, lives in our urban areas. And it is one of the most multicultural, but we're also seeing really interesting shifts. A lot of minorities are moving into the suburbs, right? Cost of living, expenses, economy, everything is really shifting. But that's something to keep in mind. So what I want to do is just say, very broadly speaking, to dispel the myths that black people just don't like the outdoors. That's not true. Right? We have to understand what those constraints are. And part of what I want to say is that racial and ethnic minorities have very strong values towards nature and the outdoors in some capacity. As part of humanity, as part of all humanity, right? And so there's a need to understand what those variables are and what it is that people enjoy about the parks. Healing agents, stress relief, right? There's lots of different factors that come into play when it comes to enjoyment. But typically what happens is racial minorities, and this is what we've studied and learned over time, racial minorities across different cultural groups participate and visit national parks at a lower level than their white counterparts. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about, all right? So in general, there are several studies that have gone on. There's a lot of information, a lot of data, but what I want to mention here is the Center for American Progress recently had a study that actually talks about, have you ever visited a park, and when was the last time in terms of the last 3 years? So you see here, people are visiting, people are going, it's just at a lower proportion. In the Rocky Mountains here, 77% of all people surveyed visited a national park within the last 3 years. All right, so people are visiting just at different rates. So this is going to be quick. A lot of the work that I've done over the years, I've actually followed the research. I've done some of my own research, and I've followed the research and understand the literature really well. And I have to thank Dr. Kathy Pickering for part of that in terms of some of the work that I've done here. But as I follow the literature, I've realized that there are many constraints, but this is what shows up in the literature most frequently. This is what comes up as the top 10. First of all, socialization as a child. I could get into each of these, but I'm not. We can talk about it later if you're interested. Lack of comfort or feeling welcome. When you hear that, ask people what that means for them. It's a little different depending on the group you're speaking with. Communication, signs, interpretation. What is that? What is going on there varies across cultures, and also the idea of messaging. Who's the messenger? Very important in different communities. Access, that also means a lot of things. Pennsylvania actually had a conference, the whole conference around parks and outdoor use was all about access one year, a couple of years ago. Education, lack of knowledge. Other ones, lack of info, lack of marketing towards minority communities. Fear and safety, which is very interesting. A lot of people across cultures will talk about fear of the elements and fear of just not, safety in terms of understanding the outdoors and how to survive, all of those things. But often what comes up in minority communities is fear of other people. Right? I hear that more in minority communities than I do in the white communities. Perceived discrimination, again, big. Avoidance. Some people will avoid spaces and places versus actually going there. Part of my research at Rocky Mountain National Park, interviewing people right in Denver. You can see the mountains. They say, my granddaddy told me the KKK hangs out up in the mountains. Why would I go? Right? That there's an avoidance factor, displacement. History matters. Okay, so these are just some things to get you thinking as we move into what the speakers are going to talk about. Lack of information, I circle that because that keeps coming up more so over time as really what some of the barriers are. People want to participate, they want to go, they want to play in the outdoors and connect in new and different ways. They don't have the information. Once that is shared and they get exposure and awareness, then things shift. People participate more. This is very real. History matters. This is Shenandoah National Park. On one side you see picnic grounds for whites only. This is your national parks. The other area is picnic grounds for Negroes. Okay, people still know about that and remember that today. So they may or may not go to certain places where they don't feel like they might be welcome, whether the signs exist or not. So that's also an important historical component. This I find really powerful and amazing. When we think about what's going on in society today, the idea of hate groups is also something that constrains people from stepping outside their comfort zone or stepping outside the environment that they're used to. And so what we see is that the number of groups has increased 13%, right? 13% from a couple of years ago. But the record, 2008, you recognize that year, it was a record number of hate groups when Obama became president. That's a sad commentary, but that's what's going on in our communities, okay? I just love this cartoon. An urban black family sheds light on some misgivings on a trip to Montana, big sky country, treasure state, land in the shining mountains. No, militia. Right, militia. That's mama wants to go, but the rest of the family isn't going to have it, right? So you got to think about how that affects our communities and the people that we want to serve. This is just a few others that come up. Perceptions of high crowds, right? Some people don't like crowds. That's fine, right? On one end of the spectrum, but also in minority communities, on the other end of the spectrum, they feel safer with crowds. You'll find fewer people in the backcountry, right? But you'll see them in areas where there are more people. It's a safety factor for them. Some minorities may be willing to visit, right? The Park Service right now, if you're studying a lot of public lands across the board, they're trying to diversify the workforce. You're hearing that more and more. And so when I survey and study people of color across the board, and what the literature shows is really about half. It's about half and half. And the reason is some people say, yes, perspective and all the values and everything that we learn from people across cultures as far as their contributions to certain land management practices. But on the other hand, people say, I don't care what flavor you are. I want to go, I'm going to have a good time, I'm going to bring my family, I want to enjoy myself, I'm going to learn something, it doesn't matter. So we have to really understand what that means and the value that comes along with that fully. This one is great. I love this because especially in certain immigrant communities, let's say, or many minority communities who use the land as sustenance or want to use the land for very non-traditional reasons, what they hear constantly is, no, you can't do that. Right? So the point is there's too many rules. That is a barrier for some people. They're not going to go because they're not allowed to do much of anything that they typically do in their family, in their culture. This one, if you've been following some of the new policies and regulations, welcome to Yosemite, this is no joke, and this came out because licensed gun owners can now bring firearms. How many people knew that? Did you know that? in terms of national parks. Why would you go? You know, there's a lot of nuts anyway. I mean, recent incident in the playground, but it's happening all over. So we have to be cautious and understand, we're going to see this someday. It's happening. That's a problem. What do we do about that? But it's a fear, it's a constraint to visiting and participation. So I just have a few articles, right? And I'm just going to show you. These have come up. I've been also gathering what's in the popular literature around national park use, lack of diversity, and why, and what's going on, right? You have an imbalance of the population in general. Why are our parks so white? Don't care about national parks. The Park Service needs you to care. Want to attract a new generation to the national parks? Find new rangers. National Park Service, racist origins. We were talking about that today. Institutionally, that is also a constraint based on how these public land agencies actually, what their management practices are and their attitudes. Code Switch podcast, being outdoorsy when you're black or brown. National Park looks to increase visits from people of color. And it goes on and on and on. My list of articles is like this over the years. All right? Meet aspiring park rangers. National Park Services practice is locked out. Right? So you see this constantly. Trying to solve it. Now it's a problem. You know, we have to address that, whatever it is, whatever the challenge is. So I'm going to wind down by saying basically Einstein had it right, y'all. All right? We all love Einstein because I love this. We cannot solve all problems with the same thinking that was used when we created them. Right? How many times do we spin our wheels? So I'm going to end there. I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues. As far as the panel, I believe we'll open it to Q&A after. All right? Thank you for being here.
Okay, I guess I'm doing the Yale effect. Yeah. So good evening.
Hi.
Try that again. Good evening. So how many people here are students? Here's how many students. How many are either natural resource majors, science majors, thinking about national parks career, so forth? See a couple here. Okay, because one of the things I want to do about, so Dina sort of took on the outside looking in. And I'm going to look at it from the inside looking out. So I'm going to spend a moment just sort of talking about what it looks like to be inside the National Park Service, and inside national parks, and more importantly, inside natural resources writ large. So I want to talk about the perspective, and you'll see a whole lot of pictures of me. I apologize, but I'm the only black ecologist I know. It's kind of easy to put your own picture in there. So my task here was actually sort of talk about why would you go into ecology, and is there barriers within the field itself? And I think particularly for natural resource, and Nina touched on some of this, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I just want you to think about some of the images and so forth that go forward. So first I have to share, and we're always allowed to brag about our moms, right?
Yes.
Yes. So how many know about the new museum that opened up this weekend? My mom's stuff is in there. Woo! The new Museum of African American History and Culture opened this weekend. My mother actually works on African American silent films. So I want you to think about that for a second. So African Americans were making films back to the 1900s, and they were making westerns in the 1900s, a guy named Oscar Michaud. And part of why I bring that up as the start of my talk is because we still have this big image that African Americans don't like the outdoors. They have no experience in the outdoors. I mean, don't do cowboy stuff, don't do rodeo. Anybody hear of, picket? Anybody know about the picket rodeos? I don't know, you guys do. But so there's history that's been lost here, and I wonder how that affects our ability to go into conservation fields writ large. So I want us to take a second. This picture may not show up as well here as I'd like. To look at this nice picture, nice national park, got a lot of little greenery, so forth and so on. Kind of looks like Horsetooth National Park, right? A little bit like Horsetooth, maybe. So when you think of that national park, what do you think you do there? Just think about that image for a second. Do you think for a second you might like to, oh, my little thingies didn't show up, oh, bummer. So you might like to go for a hike. Good place to go for a hike. Might be a good place to do some water skiing. Right, go do that new, what is that new thing they call the waterboarding? Wakeboarding. I don't got that waterboarding. The other boarding. But see, here's what as an ecologist we think of that. So you're thinking of hiking, we're thinking about boarding. Anybody know where this park is? Anyone recognize this? You all know the name. This is the Golden Heights. Okay? This is the Golden Heights. So just take a minute to think about what that does to your thinking when you put this park in place? Let's go to another national park. Thinking about this national park. A lot of mountains. Ernesto can't say anything, so I think he knows which park this is. A lot of mountains, you know, got some great places, you got some glaciers, you can get some skiing in. I like this. You can do woohoo! I worked hard on this. So you can get some skiing in, you can think about that outdoor experience. Great place for snowboarding, maybe you can do some heli skiing in it. Well, what if you think about that's the home of the Shining Path? Anyone know the Shining Path? Some of the younger generation may not know that. Okay, so what I want to think about is conservation in context. You cannot conserve a glacier or a national park unless you put it in the context of the cultural history associated with that. And I think that's an important part. So my last one is a little more close to home. I got my little bumblebee here, or actually it's a bee. So think about this national park. Anybody recognize this national park? Got a little bee bouncing around. This is a national park in the US, within Kentucky. It was also the same national park where they tested syphilis on African American men. So just think about a second what that does to your inner gut feeling when you see a national resource that has national questions and then you add the cultural context. So what I'm going to give you really quick is what I call my 20-point guide to what it means to be a socially engaged ecologist. And I'm going to do two things. One, look at ecologists, what it means to be an ecologist. I think it's really important to think about that in the era of climate change, in the era of the Paris Agreement, and the era of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we need to all know what those things are and think about what the impact, especially for students, what that impact is for what your future professions look like, because they have great impact. And secondly, and these sort of what happen when you go from a Mac to another computer, what does a socially engaged ecologist look like? What does it mean to be a socially engaged ecologist? So here's my 20-point guide to next happiness, as I call it. And I want to throw this term up here, and I know Bill is thinking about this a lot, but think about that term environmental justice and how you put that in the context of what you've learned about natural resource management. And actually, if you've been able to think about or been taught in this context, well, what does it mean to be environmentally just and to do natural resource management at the same time? Okay, so number one, it's my 20-point guide, so it's really fast. Number one, we need to learn to ask questions. And I think those questions to be socially engaged need to be internal and external. So as ecologists, when we look at what is a mountaintop, whether we're coming from a concrete jungle or we're coming from a mountaintop itself, we need to know what is the cultural context of that. Number two, you need to cruise those mountains and study anything that moves, or as I say, it doesn't move fast enough. So I've studied everything from 8 legs to 2, so you can do the math there. But I think we need to think about what it means to be an ecologist in a cultural context, whether you're from an urban jungle or whether you're from a mountaintop. And you'll hear a lot of language like, oh, we're going to talk about an urban population, and that's sort of code word for minority, versus what does urban ecology mean versus regular ecology. Ecology is ecology, whether you're a bumblebee inside New York City or you're a bumblebee inside Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And we need to get past that paradigm and think about what that does and then how that restricts our thing. And I put these 2 arrows here to point something out. Who noticed the roads? Before I put those arrows there. One person noticed the roads. It's interesting. Who noticed the roads? So again, here's that perception. We see these lovely wilderness spaces, this lovely mountain. We don't think about those roads, and we don't think about what the management of those roads means. So if I tell you, again, think about those earlier examples. This is Joshua Tree National Park. This is a desert tortoise. There's a road in the background. There's a road in the background, a place called Hidden Valley. Anyone been to Joshua Tree? Hidden Valley is a major climbing area. So what happens when you have Joshua trees within, desert tortoises within Hidden Valley? Do you remember? Have you been to that park?
I've been to the Hidden Valley campground, but we didn't see any tortoises.
You didn't see any tortoises? Right, well, so when I was the park ecologist there, if you had desert tortoise move into the campground, you close the campground. Okay, so you've got an impact on human cultural experience. So our biggest complaint was from climbers who wanted to climb, they wanted to recreate, but they didn't want to be impacted by the tortoise. Okay, so see how that cultural context all of a sudden clashes. Here's another road. This is a road going to the highest point in the high Andes. This road goes up to 4,700 meters. That's a little over, that's 100 feet over the height of Long's Peak, to put it in perspective. Right, so it's the high Andes. The local pastoral people are right here. and they pick their cattle up to take it to market. So this road has a really important context in this environmental setting. So if we don't know that, then we've defined this as a beautiful wilderness area, and we haven't defined it as a place where people make their livelihood. And what do you do about those cows in that area? Okay? Second, number 3, learn the political ecosystem. If you don't know what the Paris Agreement is, you need to go find out. I mean, there's no other way to put it, because we are now in a time of climate change, we're in a time of one of the biggest ecological agreements in this Earth's history that's moving forward to be signed. It was signed last week. It will be ratified in 2 weeks. And we need to know what that means as professionals, as emerging professionals. What does it mean when the Paris Agreement goes into effect, and how does that affect us as professionals? And what does that mean for ecologies? Okay? Number 4, be a policy wonk. How many people own a suit? If you don't, go to Goodwill and go buy one. You can get a suit at Goodwill, and you can turn around and give it back to Goodwill when you're done. But it really is important to understand how policy people think, because we can no longer talk about ecology, conservation, management in total absence of an ecological framework, because we're past that. We can't do that. We cannot manage a national park without the political landscape in which that park sits. So it's worth spending a year in a suit. It's actually really fun. You get to learn lots of things because policy matters. Policy always matters. Number 5, stay balanced. Go get a dog. No. It's really important to stay balanced, because it's important to know that we won't always win all the ecology. Not everything will be done for the benefit of ecology. It will not always be done for the benefit of conservation, and it may not always be done for the benefit of people. And it's important to understand how those things balance. Because sanity always matters. And dogs are good for that. Number 5, new learn acronyms. Interdisciplinary teams are frustrating, hard to find, and yet incredibly rewarding. We have to work across disciplinary boundaries. How many people are natural resource majors here? Just a couple? How many history? A lot. Miscellaneous others? Any science majors? You all need to talk to each other. Because you can't talk about ecology if you don't know what social science is doing. You can't talk about social scientists and environmental justice if you don't know what the ecology is doing. So it's important to think about that. Don't say, well, I like to be outdoors, so I don't want to do that office stuff. We need to sort of think about how those things work together. It's really important. And how many people have been overseas? You can admit it or not. And you work with somebody from overseas. You don't count, shut up. As Bill can tell you, working with a different culture that has a different construct of what conservation means, or, excuse me, how you even define what is wilderness, is so important before we can even talk about managing a national park. Okay, for number 5, engage with serious research colleagues. It's really important to think outside the box, think outside of CSU, think outside of a different institution, because different institutions think differently. If you're from a small liberal arts college, you will think differently than a large public college. And sometimes it's hard to see from this perspective. You're in the college, but the college actually has a lot of influence in how you think when you go out. So if you define wilderness as an area untrammeled by the footprint of man, quote unquote, the National Park Service Act of 1916, versus if you come from Beijing University, where mankind has been there for 2,000 years. Right? Very different landscape to work against. Okay? So again, at number 8, reach out to new cultures. We tend to forget that people of different cultures who don't look like us, who don't think like us, may have the same ecological resources or depend on the same ecological resources. And it's really important for us to think about what is the impact of ecosystem service on the Arab world versus the Middle Eastern world versus the people within New York City versus whatever. And we tend to set our park service frameworks against those and not think about a park in Jordan needs to be managed the same way to preserve an ecosystem resource as a park in New York City, but those communities are very different and how they use those parks are very different. Collaborate internationally. They're risky, but they're a whole lot of fun. You learn a whole lot of new things. And great food in Jordan. That's another way to think about it. But it's really important to reach outside your boundaries of comfort. Number 10, it's just up there, is to know when doors are open and to think about that. If you haven't taken a study abroad, and those are expensive, if you haven't taken time off to think about things, that's an important piece, because where ecology is going today is going to be at an international framework, and to think about what those talking points are. How many people define ecosystem services in your head? You actually have no idea how to measure it on the ground. Right? So how do you define ecosystem services? Well, it's watershed. Okay, what does that look like standing outside of CSU's campus? Does that include the Cash Laputa? What about Clear Creek? What about Spring Creek? See, we don't really know what that ecosystem service is. How many people who've been here during the Colorado floods a couple of years ago? What happened to the city of Evans? Remember Evans? So Evans collapsed, the watershed collapsed, Boulder recovered. Same watershed, same ecosystem service, very different impact. So just think about that. Navigate the obstacle course. I love my dog. Navigate the obstacle courses of life. He always reminds me to be cheerful. But it's important to think about ecological policy, ecology sense and policy do not always agree. And a great moment in the Paris Agreement, if anyone followed the Paris Agreement, is do we go to 2 degrees, we want to hold everybody to 2-degree warming, or should we hold at 1.5? You remember that discussion? What is the morally correct thing to do? Hold it at 1.5. Why? Because at 1.5, the predictions are that most of the small island states will not go underwater. At 2 degrees, small island states, Papua New Guinea, Marshall Islands, what's the other one, Tuvalu, etc., go underwater. Do we have the science data between 1.5 and 2? And the answer is no, we do not. So policy and science do not agree. What's the morally right thing to do? Think about that 1.5. The Paris Agreement's at 1.5. Okay? Celebrate interdisciplinarity. Learn to connect across disciplines, along with connecting people. People from urban places are not different from people from rural places, and we tend to forget that in our things. Lastly, this is my favorite picture. Some of you, I know Evelyn's in the back, have experienced this vehicle more than once. Be mobile in time and space. I like to tell my students that graduate school is simply a passage. You'll be there for a year or two, keep going, move on, explore. Know how to pack your bags, get on Skype, go to meetings. And I think most importantly, always think about having that soul reward. We have to stay grounded and stay in place. What is your soul reward? Is it doing the right thing? Is it saving a culture? Is it getting a little kid happy? Is it getting a kid out in the woods? What is your soul reward? And don't ever forget what that soul reward is. Have fun in fun places. Do the unexpected. And lastly, remember, socially conscious ecology may not be financially rewarding. You may not get tenure. They have a heck of a good time. So I want to thank you to leave you some of those thoughts. I want to leave a quote from the new museum. So I love this quote. God created black people, and black people created style. With that, I get to turn it over to Camille.
Thanks everybody for being here and listening to us. And I want to try something simple this evening. What I want to do is to demonstrate to you that conventional narratives of national park history are incomplete. And they will remain incomplete, I contend, so long as we ignore issues of race and diversity. I want to start by talking with you about conventional narratives of national park history. I want to tell you how and why those are incomplete. And then I want to insert a history of race and diversity into that national park history. So we're going to start out with the conventional narrative. Okay? And we start with the Organic Act, which was passed in 1916. It established the National Park Service. It's a little scary up here. And the Organic Act declared a dual mission for national parks. The parks must, on the one hand, conserve the scenery, the natural and historical objects in parks, but they must also provide for the enjoyment of humans within park settings. In other words, we've got two goals. One, to preserve resources. Another, to facilitate human enjoyment. And historians agree that this has always been a tension, a balancing act, and historians agree that there was, in truth, very little balancing of preservation and enjoyment in the early national park system. The emphasis was on human enjoyment. Parks built roadways, campgrounds, amphitheaters, they established hotel concessions as they turned the parks into scenic playgrounds for the people. Moving forward a little bit, the conventional narrative goes, only in the 1960s did the NPS begin to acknowledge that the crush of pleasure-seeking visitors was harming fragile ecosystems, damaging precious artifacts. And so finally at this point, the narrative goes, the parks turned to ecological science for help in protecting natural resources, and to professionals in archaeology and history for help in preserving cultural resources. In the 21st century, ecological science has become even more critical as parks face the challenges of global climate change. This is an important history, and it makes a lot of sense, and yet it ignores critical dynamics of race and difference. The park's privileging of human enjoyment over preservation went hand in hand with excluding nearly all but middle-class whites from the nation's scenic playgrounds. Only as park managers saw that they had neglected park ecosystems did they begin to recognize very slowly, very haltingly, that they had accepted a quite reductive view of the people who belonged in parks, whether as visitors or as employees. Now it helped, of course, that the greater ecological awareness of the 60s and 70s coincided with an upsurge of activism calling for racial and social justice. These two things happened at the same time. The message coming from all corners was that skewed relationships of power had been ignored. We had ignored at great cost human efforts to dominate nature. Playing in the parks without trying to preserve the parks had come at a cost. Okay? We had ignored at great cost white efforts to dominate people of color, men's efforts to dominate women. And my goal today is to trace very briefly, very episodically, the intertwining of race and diversity with issues of race and with issues of preservation and enjoyment in national parks. I'm going to focus on the years from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century. I'm letting my co-panelists talk with us a little bit more about continuities with the past in the present day and meaningful breaks from the past that may be occurring in the present day. Okay? So, here we have a slide that speaks to the establishment of Yellowstone National Park in 1872. We see a group of Bannock Indians on that slide. And what this is a reminder of is that the founding of national parks in the late 19th century coincided with the removal of Native Americans, sometimes by force, from parkland. This happened at Yellowstone, it happened at Yosemite, it happened elsewhere. Native Americans were removed, excluded try to return to those lands to engage in typical economic or cultural practices. They were deemed trespassers, poachers. Their behaviors were criminalized. Even painting the national parks in the 19th century involved racial exclusion and erasure. Grafton Tyler Brown, the painter of this very, very beautiful image, was the only prominent landscape painter of the 19th century West whose background was African American. Yet Brown suppressed that background, passing as white, after he began actively pursuing a career in Western landscape painting. Sometimes Native Americans were brought back to individual parks, not as regular visitors, but rather to lend elements of their heritage to park settings. In 1913, for example, supporters of what would soon become Rocky Mountain National Park, and Rocky Mountain National Park, of course, was established in 1915. Supporters of that park arranged a pack trip with two elderly Arapaho men who had lived in the region before being removed to a reservation. And the goal of the park supporters was to acquire from the Arapaho men indigenous names that might lend authenticity to various sites in the park. So let's find an Arapaho name for that meadow or that mountain, making that park seem more authentic. Meanwhile, of course, intending to exclude Arapaho themselves into the future. During the 1910s and 1920s, Yosemite National Park held Indian Field Days, hoping to boost white visitation. Members of tribes who had lived in the Yosemite area were brought back to the park, quote, to lend their quaint and picturesque presence to the scene, end quote. And they sold baskets and other crafts to visitors. The early parks deliberately appealed to white men's quest for a vigorous kind of masculinity. And promotional materials in the early parks of the West highlighted opportunities to engage in physically demanding sports such as mountaineering. Interestingly, white women pursued mountaineering as well, and they were accepted by men as climbing companions, even as climbing leaders, at least until the sport became highly technical. And this is an image of a number of white women on the ledges of Long's Peak in 1913, with men in the group as well. And you can imagine what it must have been like to climb in skirts. Indeed, white men and women of Colorado's middle class flocked to Rocky Mountain National Park in the 1920s, either to drive the park's roads or to climb its beautiful peaks. African American visitors were not welcome in the park, but middle-class blacks in Denver were very eager to experience the pleasures of nature and outdoor recreation. They established a resort called Lincoln Hills. It was west of Denver, and it became an alternative to the national park experience. In partnership with the African American branch of the YWCA, Lincoln Hills also established a camp, Camp Nizoni, which offered African American young women and girls opportunities to play and develop skills in the out of doors. Black girls were prohibited or excluded from the Y camp in Colorado that was called Camp Lookout. So this was an alternative for them as well. Here we see a photo that we've already seen that Nina showed. Elsewhere, national parks were, in southern states, were formally segregated. Rocky Mountain National Park was not formally segregated. Shenandoah did become formally segregated in the 1930s, setting aside picnic areas for blacks, contracting with a private company to open a restaurant and lounge for black patrons in Shenandoah. Importantly, Harold Ickes, who was Secretary of the Interior under Franklin Roosevelt and a very active member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, disagreed with segregation in the NPS, and he moved southern parks toward integrated facilities during the late 1940s. By the 1950s, increasing numbers of African Americans in the South were visiting Shenandoah, making clear their interest in nature, their continued interest in outdoor recreation. And this is a club called the something near City Club. I can't read it quite now, quite at the moment. But this was a city club.
I think it's New York City Club.
Okay, thank you. A city club, and so African Americans were going in fairly substantial groups to Shenandoah National Park. Still, resistance to integration was acute in many communities, and national parks declined to put out a welcome mat to people of color. It took decades for civil rights and social justice activists to impress upon the NPS the need to combine an ethic of care for natural and cultural resources with an ethic of care for the diverse peoples who might enjoy, learn from, and contribute to the NPS. And that movement for change is still ongoing today. We're still working on it. So I'm going to stop here, and I think Camille is next.
You know when you go to museums and parks and there's the interpretive information and then all of a sudden you switch and there's a photograph or some art or something to sort of change the perspective with which you're seeing things? That's me. I'm going to do some poetry and talk a little bit about my experiences in the national parks. This is the title poem of my newest, forthcoming collection of poetry. It's Trophic Cascade. Really quickly, we've got some people who would probably know. Can we do a very quick description of what a trophic cascade is? Anybody in the room? It's a shift in an ecological system from the trophy. If there's a change at the trophy level, what happens all the way down the system is often very large shifts will happen in the entire ecological system when you change something at the top end of the level. Trophic cascade. After the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone, and as anticipated, their culling of deer, trees grew beyond the deer stunt of the mid-century. In their upreach, songbirds nested, who scattered seed for underbrush, and in that cover warrened snowshoe hare. Weasel and water shrew returned, also vole. And came soon hawk and falcon, bald eagle, kestrel, and with them hawk shadow, falcon shadow. Eagle shade and kestrel shade haunted newly buried runnels, where mule deer no longer rummaged, cautious as they were now of being surprised by wolves. Berries brought bear, while undergrowth and willows growing right down to the river brought beavers who dam. And muskrats came to the dams, and tadpoles came to the night song of the fathers of tadpoles. With water striders, the dark gray American dipper bobbed in fresh pools of the river, and fish stayed, and the bear who fished also culled deer fawns, and to their kill scraps came vulture and coyote, long gone in the region,
until now. And their scats scattered seed, and more trees, brush, and berries grew up along the river that had run straight and so flooded, but thus dammed, compelled to meander, is less prone to overrun. Don't you tell me this is not the same as my story. All this life, born from one hungry animal, this whole new landscape, the course of the river changed. I know this. I reintroduced myself to myself, this time a mother, after which nothing was ever the same. So that's Yellowstone, and the story of what happens with the reintroduction of wolves to the valley. And in fact, the course of the Yellowstone River eventually changed entirely as a result of the entire ecosystem shift that happened with the return of this trophic creature. And I discovered that story right about the time I had a kid. And that's that poem. But when I was thinking about what it was that I wanted to talk about today, I wanted to think about this. I wanted to think about what it means when a life form that is part of the system is excluded and or returned, removed, silenced, present all along but ignored, right? And how it changes everything about how we perceive that space. In the early 2000s, I had this opportunity during the summer to serve as the artist in residence at Rocky Mountain National Park. I was not living in Colorado at the time. I had a tenure track job at a small college in Virginia, but I'm a Western girl. I'm a Colorado-born Californian. And so, like any opportunity when I was on the East Coast, any opportunity I had to come to this side of the Mississippi River, I was like, I'll take it, right? And so there I was for 2 weeks at Rocky Mountain National Park, and I would wake up every morning about 6:30, 7 o'clock, and I would go for a long hike somewhere above the tree line. I would be back to my little cabin. You know this cabin if you've been to Rocky Mountain National Park. It's in Moraine Valley. It's one of those 3 stone cabins that's at the top of the Moraine Valley by the Interpreter's Lodge there. And they were these exclusion cabins where people who owned homes who weren't kicked out of the park were allowed to stay. And this cabin is where I stayed for 2 weeks. And I would wake up early, I'd go for my hikes, I would come back, I would write all day. But during those hikes, people would be like, whoa, what are you doing here? And they would say, like, I don't see black people out here, right? And they would just say it straight out. And I would be like, well, here I am. I'm your person for the summer, right? And over again, this kind of sense of, you don't belong here. Why are you in this space? Would confront me. And I'm like, but this is my space. This is my landscape. I'm from here. I was born. I'm a native of this state. I grew up in Southern California drinking that water that flowed there, right? Into my tap through a lot of subterfuge, right? To get it to me in Southern California. Why can't I be here? Eventually, during this period, I started to also think about what it meant to be an artist, writing about this space that I loved and these thoughts that I loved, and not being seen in any of the journals, in any of the collections of nature literature. When I finally did the literature review that I needed to convince the press to do this anthology of African American nature poetry, I discovered essentially 6 black poets and 10 poems that were over and over and over revealed in these spaces. And so I started to think a lot about what it means to disappear people from the language. But I somehow, despite only 10 poems, managed to come up with a book this thick, right? That these were not newly penned poems. These were poems that already existed, but were just not part of what we included when we thought about who wrote about the natural landscape and how and why, right? Part of what happens is that when when people of color enter into these spaces, all this complicated stuff shows up, right? History and culture and segregation and all these other kind of questions that make it not necessarily pretty, not pristine, not a glorious escape into the world, but histories that remind you of eradications and disseminations, etc. Or even this poem that I wrote while I was in Rocky Mountain National Park. One of the things I had to do was like gift a poem to the park, right? And I went on a hike up to the Dream Lake Path, right? And you're at the top, you're at the headwaters of the Colorado River. And I start this poem, I finish this poem, and then I realize this poem has a lot to do with what it means to be a woman, right? In this culture. What it means to be somebody who has this potential that gets taxed and diminished and desecrated to some extent. Even when I was just trying to write a poem about a pretty pond, right? How she keeps faith, Dream Lake, headwaters of the Colorado. Come to the quiet time, water still in bed, to the rock, dissimulated by the rush, but still loved. Stone like knees and elbows, like fingers, the skull around eyes, like calves, thighs, and forearms, log long, lying in and resting in the bed. Water moving, a body turning as rock turns with and against rock. The meadow long meander coming later. The straight surge down mountain coming soon. Here, now, this little time when rock rests still in her bed. Before things are muddied, before the turbulence recalled by walls that they have built, before water must confront the power lust of men and stay and be stayed, move or be moved by some damn will beyond her own. Rock not with her anymore, but always set against her. Nowhere to run but into the field. Her bed, no more her bed. Remember the first fall. The fall that brought her to this quiet place. Her body a quick curing bruise. First blue, then green, then clear, so flawless veins showed through. She is a sky tear, remembering. She is a cloud curl wrapped around herself. So head heavy, she falls again. So that was about 2001, and not long afterwards, I started working on this anthology, and in the process of doing this collection of, there's about 200 poems in there, I realized that this intersection between conversations about culture, about gender, about history, about economics, about placement, about the facts that we think about, we're talking about the national park here, and we continue to be talking about these sort of wilderness parks, but it's a very small percentage. What is it? 10% of the national parks are wilderness parks. A significant number of our national parks are in urban spaces, but we don't think about that. We think about a park being this open other. I remember going to the headwaters of the Mississippi River with a guy who grew up in Baton Rouge at the basin of the Mississippi River, and he was like, I thought we were going to a park. Where's the playground, right? And I want to laugh at him, and then at the same time I'm like, yes, because what is this perception that we've given about what a park can be and who goes there, what we do there, right? Is a park always about recreation, but can a park be about history? Can a park be about reckoning, right? As opposed to just recreation, right? All of these things are about changing the dialogue, about changing the language, and then changing the welcome mat, right? And who we welcome and how we welcome and the language that we use to allow that welcome to happen, right? And a space that is a space of ownership and belief and trust for all kinds of people and beings at all, right? Okay, I'm going to pass on to Alex.
All right, thanks everybody. So when we think about national parks, we usually see these types of image, right? They're pretty serene, iconic, national park images. This is what we think of when we think about, or this is what we see and think of when we think about, Glacier National Park, or Crater Lake National Park, right? Rocky Mountain National Park, Longs Peak, right down the road. But after seeing these presentations from the other panelists, what are we missing here? What's that? People, right? We're missing the history. We're not thinking about who actually were here prior to the designation of these national parks, okay? In the old school interpretation of these parks, they didn't mention the people that lived there before, right? So the removal of Native Americans or the dispossession of Native Americans from these lands, or even the presence of them, were never mentioned. And now as we're moving past that and we're thinking about diversity, we're thinking about including additional voices, multiple voices, moving with the next generation of stewards, and wondering, how can we connect with people? We need to bring those stories out, right? We need to start talking about those Native Americans that were on these lands, that lived here, that had meaning and connection to these lands. So next time that you guys visit a national park, I want you to start thinking about that. What imagery, what history aren't we typically hearing about? And there's some other questions that you should also be asking yourself. Who built these parks? Okay? Death Valley, when it was designated as a national monument in 1933, during the New Deal era, they also had hundreds of men come to the park to help build roads, campgrounds, trails, utility services, structures, and they worked in the blistering heat, right? Who's been to Death Valley? What time of year do you not want to go there? I mean, I just looked on their website a couple days ago. It's over like 110 degrees out there. Can you imagine building roads? I wouldn't be able to do it. I wouldn't be able to do it at all. But the CCC sent hundreds of men here to build an infant park from the ground up. They had camps all throughout the valley. I think there were about 3 camps, separate camps here. And usually when you see images of the CCC, at least the ones that I've seen, they're usually hard-working, strapping young white men, right? You don't normally hear about the diverse side of the CCC. Okay, so to give you an example here, this is Gerald Leyva, Mexican-American young man. He joined the CCC in 1941. Guess where he ended up? Death Valley. He built roads, and the CCC, they constructed over 500 miles of roads. And that's just roads. That's not even talking about trails or the number of buildings that they also constructed as well. His experience there, he wrote letters to his family and friends. They earned about $25 a month. Okay, $20 of that went back home. $5 they were able to keep. There's records of Gerald
and he's sending that money back home, and he's also writing IOUs to purchase, candies or other items for himself while he's there. His time in the CCC had a lasting impression on him, something that he talked with his family about, and he passed on those stories for years to come. These are the types of stories that we also need to hear about when we think about the CCC and working in the national parks, okay? Especially when we're trying to make it relevant to other populations. Now, as the National Park Service is moving towards more diverse stories, we're also designating unique sites as well, not just national parks, but other park units. And over the last 3 decades, we've designated 4 major parks dedicated to the Japanese American incarceration history during World War II. That's another side of my job. I work with the Japanese American Confinement Sites Grant Program. And I visited Tule Lake a couple months ago, and there were 18,000 Japanese American citizens, right? Citizens incarcerated here at this site during World War II. 18,000. Across the board, 120,000. Following the war, many of these sites were completely razed. The buildings were sold, demolished, auctioned off. So what was left was a barren landscape. Okay, the removal of the history, and then also the removal of the humanity that was once at this site. Okay, it's hard to talk about these sites too. It's really hard, especially for interpreters. But for sites that do have some remnants of the past, some buildings, Tule Lake, for example, has a jail. It's the only jail that we have among all the 10 sites, the former War Relocation Authority sites, the major camps. And within it, there are some really telling remnants of the past, something that we really need to share with our visitors. Okay, people that left their homes, actually, they did not leave their homes, they were forcibly removed from their homes, right? Sent away from their families, incarcerated in these sites, and there's inscriptions all throughout the walls of this jail. Okay, and one of which says, "Show me the way to go home." When you see an image like this up close, you look at the wall, right at your height, I can't even imagine. I can't imagine being there, having to write this, and thinking about what's going to happen to my life after this. Am I going to make it out of here? They were in here for years, right? Has anyone been to Manzanar? Oh, okay, a few. So Manzanar, we have Tule Lake, we also have Minidoka, and more recently, in 2015, we also have Honouliuli National Monument being designated in Hawaii. But these are sites of remembrance, they're sites of turmoil. All right, people lived here. We have Japanese Americans who were born in these camps. They worked the land and were a huge source of labor for local economies. Many people don't know that. Even people that are still living in these rural areas might not even know that a huge source of labor, were Japanese Americans. And many also died at these camps. There are cemeteries at these former sites. This is Manzanar cemetery area, and they also have a monument here. But it's not just the National Park Service that are, designating these sites. The Japanese American community themselves and the organizations across the country are actively involved in the designation of these sites. They're working together with the Park Service and other national Japanese American organizations, are working really hard to get this history spread across the country in remembrance, and to have these sites designated. This is Honouliuli during the war. And in 2015, we were able to designate that site as a national monument. And for this particular site, the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii was really instrumental in the designation of this site, but also more importantly, before 2015, over the last probably 2 decades, they worked actively to even find the site. In Hawaii, they had really thick, overgrown tropical forests, right? And they had to search, do archaeological work, and look for the site themselves, and they had to use oral histories to try and pinpoint exactly where it was in Hawaii. Now, when it was finally designated, they also did a lot of groundwork for the Park Service, which will ultimately help our interpretation of the site. They did oral histories, they worked with former attorneys themselves to do pilgrimages to the site. So when we're thinking about these new sites and designating sites as well, we also are changing our model of how we're working with the community. The Park Service isn't just doing the interpretation by themselves now. They're actively creating a partnership with those that experience the history in their own lives. So Sally Jewell, our secretary. This is a former internee at the site as well, or her family was. And diversity is becoming an increasingly large issue for the Park Service. And a lot of that over the last decade or two has been because of the pressure that the community, ethnic communities have put on the National Park Service. They want their stories told. And with that, we're getting more diverse sites. Cesar Chavez, 2012, we were able to designate this as a national monument, largely supported by the Latino community. And the Park Service is also focusing on heritage initiatives to make sure that stories that weren't told before are now being told in the future. Or, in another way, stories that parks aren't currently telling in the existing parks are being told. Uncovering these stories, recovering these stories is really important. So over the last few years, we've had the Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Initiative come out, the American Latino Initiative, as well as the Women's History Initiative come out. And this covers National Park Service unit designations, as well as National Historic Landmarks. So the Park Service has a different side to it that a lot of people don't really know about. Okay, so we have the park units, but we have a programmatic side as well. And with that, the Park Service is now focused on bringing the mission of the Park Service outside of its boundaries and trying to relate and make the parks relevant, but also finding stories that are really important to communities and thinking of alternative ways to bring those stories alive and to really make them relevant with the communities. I work with the National Heritage Area program. Do you guys know of any heritage areas around here? Cache? Yeah, right in your backyard, Cache Zapruder National Heritage Area. Focuses on the river corridor between Fort Collins and Greeley. And heritage areas are not managed by the Park Service. There's 49 of them across the country, but they're not managed by the Park Service, but they fall under our purview, essentially. And we have this alternative designation where it's designated by Congress. There are boundaries to it. They're invisible. All right? But communities are the managing entities. Communities themselves, it's a very grassroots type of movement. Communities really try and focus on the heritage tourism. They dictate what their tourism will look like, how they connect with maybe a national park or maybe a state park, and they pull together the natural, the cultural, the historic piece all together in a really nationally significant landscape. So for Northern Rio Grande, which is in New Mexico, that's one of our heritage areas as well, they focus on 3 cultures within that area. Can you guys name a few? New Mexico? I heard some. Tiwa? Okay, so you have the tribal. Okay. What else? Mexican. And the Spanish, exactly. And so those 3 cultures, right, they blended together in this region. but they also clashed. So even today, they have competing interests, right? And so the heritage area is trying to act as a third party to bring everybody together to focus on historic preservation initiatives, or maybe resource conservation, visitation, heritage tourism. They're acting as a cohesive unit to try and bring these stories, these three stories together. So they might encourage visitors to visit nationally important sites in NHL that would be focused on religious or spiritual elements for the Spanish and the Mexican side. Or maybe they might encourage their visitors that might be traveling from Santa Fe up to Espanola to visit Huye Cliffs dwellings and see some Native American sites. If you're thinking about World Heritage Sites, Taos Pueblo, another tribal element here. So national parks and the National Park Service, as we're working on the future, we're not just solely concerned about what's within our parks. We are trying to connect people to their communities. We need to step outside our boundaries too. We can't expect people to come to us, right? So an added layer for us is, how do we support communities that already have the resources there and get people that are in those communities to be stewards of these sites, and maybe they'll even visit one of our national parks too. And O'Keeffe, her paintings tie directly to the New Mexican landscape. This is outside the Ghost Ranch, which she lived on. And you can just see right here, matching up. These are inspiring landscapes, right? The natural side's really inspiring, and that cultural side is very inspiring too. So as we think about the next 100 years, right? We just celebrated our centennial. We need to start thinking about a little bit more within the Park Service. You know, how do we make things relevant? How do we bring out these stories that really resonate with our visitors? And for me, the story of Gerald Leyva, that resonates with me. Seeing a Mexican American work in the CCC, I never saw that before. My mother's maiden name, Leyva. I heard about my grandpa working in the CCC. It wasn't until a month ago that my uncle handed me this photo. I'll try not to cry. But this resonates for me. This is inspiring. Having that connection, I want to go visit Death Valley, maybe not during the summer. But I want to hear his story when I go there. I want to see the roads that he helped create. And if we can tell those stories, those other stories for visitors, and try and make a connection like that, just like I had seeing this image, then maybe we can inspire people to preserve these parks for the next 100 years. Maybe that'll save us something. So I'll leave you with that.